As we continue on with our discussion of Chapter 9, let us now begin to consider terrorism. For anyone who tries to study terrorism, one of the first hurdles that they will run into will be the problem of definition. It's very difficult to define terrorism. And the reason for this is because the inherent in the definition of terrorism are often subjective considerations. Um, we can have a broad definition of terrorism that maybe we can all agree on, but when we start to apply it to specific groups, we may find that there are some groups we want to call terrorism because we want to call terrorists because we don't like them, but there are other groups that are engaging in acts that really look like terrorism, but maybe they're fighting for our side. So we don't want to label them as terrorists. So you have, beyond the basic objective definition of terrorism, you have all these subjective considerations. So you see that captured on this slide in this particular phrase that I have in the first bulleted point. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. We will see this throughout the history of terrorism. That, for instance, we're going to, in a later presentation, we're going to cover Afghanistan and the Mujahideen. And so when the Mujahideen, this group of Islamic fighters, were fighting the Russians, the Soviets, we Americans said they were freedom fighters. But when they eventually reform, some of them reform into Al Qaeda, and they're targeting America, now they're terrorists. So you have these subjective considerations that you run into and you have to be aware of. The traditional definition that people can generally agree on, as long as we're not applying it to a specific group and have to debate whether we want to apply it to that group or not, but a general definition that's been used traditionally is terrorism is violence or threat of violence that's meant to bring about political change. So it's not just violence for violence sake, but it's meant to bring about some kind of political change. Well, we've expanded that definition in many instances. So now we may say, well, it's not just violence or threat of violence against people, it could also include property damage. And especially in our digital world, crimes against computers. So if some group is hacking into a particular computer network and it's doing it to cause disruption or cause political change, or it's an attack, some other kind of change, then we can view that perhaps as terrorism, even though it didn't involve a threat to a person or violence against a person. So property damage could be included. Also, other motivations could be included, not just political. So maybe the person is using this violence to try to bring about social change. The KKK. The KKK is not really interested in overthrowing the United States government, so it's not really interested in political change in that sense, but it's interested in establishing greater white supremacy. So that would be a social or cultural change it's striving for. Al Qaeda may be interested in political change, but it's also obviously interested in religious change, establishing greater dominance for Islam. And so we can go through these. We can see it may be social change, maybe religious, it may be cultural, it could be something like environmental change. There's a group known as the Earth Liberation Front, and they've carried out attacks on ski lodges to burn them down. They've put spikes in trees that were going to be logged and cut down to try to damage the loggers' saws and other equipment. And they've engaged in these actions not because they want to accomplish political change, but because they want to stop what they view as harm to the environment by building a ski lodge in a pristine area or cutting down virgin timber. And so these groups may engage in property damage or violence that's directed at environmental change. So there could be all kinds of other justifications for this violence, but it's violence, threat of violence, property damage that's meant for some kind of change. It's not just to acquire money like an ordinary criminal or to threaten someone just because you don't like them on a personal level, but there are broader interests at stake, and that's what distinguishes terrorism from other crimes of violence and property. There are different types of terror. Usually when we think of terrorists today, we think of this first one that I have listed, terror against the state. So terror against society. So these are attacks against a government and its people by non-state actors. So this is not one military attacking another military. So it's not, um, you know, the Germans invading Poland. The Germans, the German army was an official military entity. These are what we're referring to with terrorists is these are non-state actors, so terrorist individuals, not representing a particular government, but they carry out attacks against a government or its people. And so that's what we traditionally think of as terrorism. But we may also have other forms of terrorism that actually involve the state. So state terror, actions by a government against its own people. And those actions are illegal or violate human rights laws. So it's not just this is a legitimate arrest, but these are you're rounding people up and locking them up because they're dissenting, they're protesting against the government, or there's some kind of threat to the government. It could be killing those people, and again, it's not killing them as part of a valid legal execution, but illegally killing them. So actions by government against its people that are meant to, these acts are meant to intimidate the people or eliminate suppressed dissent. So we can think of Saddam Hussein carrying out actions against his own people to try to discourage dissent, to make sure that he stays in power. State-sponsored terror is when the state is involved not as a direct actor, that would be state terror, but state-sponsored terror would be when a particular government supports the actions of terrorists. So it's working with the terrorists to carry out acts against maybe another country. So the example I've given is Iran has traditionally supported Hamas, which is a group that has carried out attacks against Israel. So Iran hasn't carried out the attacks directly against Israel, but it's supported Hamas so that they could carry out the attacks against Israel. Other types of terrorism, we can classify the terrorism in other ways. So we just saw we could classify it by who's acting. Is it the state? Is it private individuals? Is it state-supported terror? But we can also examine terrorism according to where it occurs. Does it cross international boundaries, or is it solely within the country by members of that country? So if it's crossing borders, if it's being carried out by foreign individuals against another country, then we could call that international terrorism. If it's being carried out entirely within a country by people who are living in the country, who are maybe citizens of that country, then we can phrase that as domestic terrorism. International terrorism has increased over the past several decades. Why? Well, for one thing, it's easier to travel internationally than you could, 100 years ago. So now, obviously, you can travel by plane, by faster boats, by other means. Um, you can also communicate across. You can send your message across international lines much more easily. So you don't need an official news agency to do it. You can send it through, obviously, the internet. You can put a YouTube video up if you're ISIS, and everyone in the world can see it. You couldn't have done that 30 years ago. And so there are easier means to not only travel, but also to send your message around the world. So there's greater incentive to engage in international terrorism because there's a greater chance that some of your goals are going to be accomplished. Also, we see more international terrorism because there are fewer what I have listed here as real wars. So conventional wars. There are fewer conventional wars because we don't have the same kind of military balance that we had maybe during World War II, when you had a variety of countries that had roughly equal militaries, and so conventional war was more possible. Today, you have the United States, which is really the military superpower. Obviously, China and Russia are important, but there are very few countries that can challenge the military superiority of those countries. So if someone wants to take on the United States, it's unlikely they're going to do it in a conventional war like the Japanese and the Germans did in World War II. It's more likely that it's going to be through acts of terror. Domestic terrorism, these are homegrown terrorists. And so the clearest example of this in the United States would be the Oklahoma City bombings when Timothy McVeigh back in the 1990s ended up bombing the federal building because he was part of white We believe he's part of a white supremacist movement to some degree, but he certainly was someone who was opposed to the current government. He had different motivations, but he drove a truck bomb up to a fertilizer-based truck bomb up to um, the outside, the exterior of the federal building in Oklahoma City, and eventually detonated his homemade bomb and blew off the front of the building and killing uh, not only federal employees but also children who were in a daycare there. And so it was the deadliest attack on American soil before 9/11. So domestic terrorism has been a concern in the United States and has been a significant part of terrorist attacks against the United States. We often only focus on international terrorism, but domestic terrorism is important. We also may have lone wolf terrorism, and we've seen this of late in attacks by people who claim some kind of support for ISIS, but they're really not part of ISIS. But they're inspired by these terrorist groups. They've not received direct support or instructions from those groups, but nonetheless, they are saying that they're acting on behalf of these groups to carry out attacks. And so groups like ISIS sometimes promote this. ISIS definitely does. It has encouraged people to, whenever possible, carry out these attacks, whether it's driving a car into a crowd of people or it's going into a business and shooting people, whatever it may be, but acting on their own, but in the name of ISIS. So there isn't direct support from ISIS or Al Qaeda or whatever other group that these people claim to be acting for, but they act on their own to carry out these attacks.